Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to one of the Wisconsin Union Directorate's first Rise Up Week events for this upcoming week. My name is Carrie, and I'm the Vice President of Internal Relations for the Wisconsin Union Directorate. And tonight, we are privileged to be collaborating with students from the ACLU Student Alliance, ASM, and BIPOC Coalition on a town hall-style question and answer discussion, really delving into crucial areas of the executive powers. And before we get started, we just want to be able to read a land acknowledgement and take into account the ancestral Ho-Chunk land that UW-Madison is established on and its unethical history of occupation. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies Ho-Chunk land, a place their name has called Dejope since time immemorial. In the 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison repeats the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. So please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering with these truths every single day. And now we'd like to welcome our guest lecturer, Dr. Sharece Thrower. Dr. Thrower is an associate professor in the political science department at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And we're very excited to have her with us tonight to discuss her extensive research into the powers of the executive branch and especially unitary executive theory. So welcome virtually to UW-Madison, Dr. Thrower. To start off with some opening remarks, could you please give us some background on executive orders, the environment that we see them in now, and their long-lasting impacts that they may have in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. And thank you to the Wisconsin Union Directorate for organizing this and to all of the student organizations that are involved. I think this is very impressive. I feel like when I was in college, I didn't have the bandwidth to engage with all these really important issues. And I really feel like all of you and young people across the country are really taking up the mantle. And so I definitely commend you for that. And I'm honored to be part of this event. I think the work that all of you are doing this week is so important. And just to give you a little bit of background about what I do before I answer that first question, I'm an associate professor at the political science department at Vanderbilt. And broadly, I study executive power, and I study the ways in which the executive branch, so the president, executive branch agencies, governors, other actors at the state level, how they're constrained by the other branches of government. A lot of people tell me when I tell them what I study, when I say that I study executive politics, a lot of people say it must be a great time to study executive politics. The truth is, I don't know if that's the case. There's so much uncertainty right now under the current administration about the implications for executive power, for different groups of people, for just our democratic system and what that's going to look like in the future. But what I hope to do is, with the research that I've done, is hopefully shed some light on some of that uncertainty as best I can. But I don't have all the answers, but I certainly hope to contribute to the conversation is my goal. So to answer that first question, just to give you some background on executive orders and executive power, just to start, to describe just the different powers that the president can do. Typically, we think about the president having two types of powers, formal powers and informal powers. Starting with the informal powers are those powers that the president can exercise that aren't given in the Constitution. So the fact that the president is the most visible figure in the world, the fact that the president has this platform that to make public appeals, that there's this inherent respect for the office. These are the sorts of things that aren't written down or derived from the Constitution. Those are what we think about informal powers, the president's kind of ability to bargain with other members of Congress and other political actors. And then there's the formal powers. So the formal powers are those that are explicitly given to the president, either explicitly in the Constitution, so things like the veto power, but also the powers that are derived from vague language in the Constitution. And so this is where the power to issue executive orders comes from, this sort of vague language that the president has the ability to control the executive branch. So the first question about the effects of executive orders and the longevity and what I think about that. I think if we think about the political environment today, and in general, just in our theories of executive power, both Congress and the courts have the ability to constrain executive power. They have the tools to do so. Congress can strike down, pass laws to strike down an executive order. Courts can hear cases to strike down executive orders, and we've seen that certainly in the Trump administration. But they may not always have sort of the will to do so. And so thinking about the different sorts of incentives that Congress might have to overturn executive orders, so whether or not the Congress and president are from the same party, and the same with the courts, that's really going to shape how long executive orders are able to last. And sort of secondly, presidents, when they issue executive orders, it has to be based in some sort of authority. And so this authority is usually derived from the Constitution or from explicit statutes. And if the president doesn't have authority to issue these executive orders, then that authority is going to be challenged in courts. So really, how long executive orders really last is based on two things. It's based on sort of whether or not presidents had the authority in the first place to execute the executive order. If they didn't, that's going to be challenged in court. And then secondly, whether or not Congress and the courts have the incentives to strike down the executive order, which could be dependent on the people that make up those branches of government.
Hello, Dr. Thrower. My name is Pradyumna Rao, and I am the Vice President of External Affairs right here at the Wisconsin Union Directorate. We're really pleased to have you here. And my first question to you, after hearing what you have talked about executive powers, straight out of the bat, I would like to ask you, why should students listening in or any of the audience listening in really care about these powers, and how does it really affect them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a key thing to remember about these powers and to think about the president is that the president has control over the executive branch. And so these executive orders are directions to the executive branch on how to implement the law. Now, the executive branch is critically important for the policies that we actually see today. So they have the responsibility of taking the laws that Congress passes and then actually implementing them into policies that we follow today. So the rules and regulations and the guidelines that dictate our everyday behavior, those are made through the executive branch. And so the fact that the president has the ability to basically command the executive branch and shape the way the executive branch are implementing these laws through regulations and the way that they're interpreting these laws, that is going to affect our daily lives. Like, the executive branch makes rules and regulations on everything imaginable under the sun, to educate, rules regarding education, to healthcare, to environmental protection. Like, these are the policies that affect us every day. And the executive branch is the one that has the say in what these policies are going to look like from a day-to-day basis.
Okay. Well, then let's, I'd like to ask you a policy question then. So this question is about STEM and education with regards to the executive branch. So the needs of and focus of the US economy over the last couple of administrations has been improving the diversity of the workforce and their STEM literacy. Presidents have consistently promised us to increase STEM education and access through funding various entities such as NGOs or directly through universities. How much power and ability does the executive branch have to follow through on these promises? Should STEM education rely on the power of the Congress, or should it rely on the power of the president?
Yeah, so education is such an important policy area. I don't have to tell all of you that. And it is something certainly that, you know, presidents and other political actors talk about all the time on the federal level. But the thing to remember about education policy, the way that our political system is set up right now, education policy is very decentralized. In other words, most of the policies concerning education are being made at the state and the local level. So they're the ones that are really sort of guiding the policies that are actually made. So they're different from state to state. What the federal government can do is provide funding for the types of programs that state government and local governments are trying to pursue. And a lot of times it has changed from sort of president to president about how much strings are attached to these sorts of fundings. So things, initiatives like No Child Left Behind or the Race to the Top initiative, all these things are kind of federal initiatives that have various degrees of strings attached to them. But at the end of the day, it's the state and the local governments that are making decisions. But it's the federal government that a lot of times needs to kind of step in and assist in terms of funding. I think another really important relevant issue here is, what should the federal government's role be in sort of equalizing the resource disparities that we see in state and local governments in terms of access to education? And I think that's a way that having maybe a strong central response in terms of the types of funding, that can be a way that the federal government can help in sort of equalizing those opportunities.
Thank you very much for answering my questions, Dr. Thrower. I will now pass it on to the ACLU Student Alliance and for their questions.
Thank you again, Dr. Thrower, for joining us today. The first question, well, my name is Ananda. I'm with the ACLU Student Alliance. And the first question we have for you deals with society, because we all know that the executive branch can only do so much with the society they're given. And so we want to say a prominent figure in politics has been the white liberal. And for years, Black activists have protested the intentions of the white liberal as being a hindrance to the Black liberation or the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you think this is still true today? And what role should the white liberal play in the midst of a revolution? And if not them, who is up to actively fight for the liberation of Black and brown folks besides Black and brown folks themselves?
This is a great question. This is a tough question too. So I don't have the answers to everything, but I'll do my best to sort of navigate, at least from my observations and how I've thought about this. So I think first and foremost, when we think about advocating for sort of the liberties of Black and brown people, in my opinion, I think the most important thing for white liberals to do is to make sure that it's the Black and brown people whose voices are heard the loudest, right? Who are sort of the forefront of sort of communicating what their interests are. I feel like I've seen a lot of examples where well-intentioned white activists have sort of taken up a lot of space in sort of these realms of political activism for Black and brown folks, and that have unintentionally, I think mostly, but unintentionally drowned out those voices. And so I think their primary role, should be to make sure that those voices are heard and that we have a system where those voices can be heard. Obviously, that may not work out always in all spaces, because there are some spaces where, frankly, Black and brown voices are just not in the room. So you can think about boardrooms, you can think about academia, all sorts of situations where we just have such a lack of diversity, where our voices we're just not in the room. And so I think in those situations, I think that our white liberal allies can be a powerful voice if they hold a position of power, especially in a realm where Black and brown voices aren't heard. I think that can be their responsibility to sort of advocate for the interests of those that are just not in the room to be heard. But I will say, before doing that, I think that their first step should be to listen and to really understand what those interests are. Because I feel like a lot of times there can be advocates, however well-intentioned that they are, they think they may not know what we want, but they don't. And so I think it's important that they take the time to sit down and listen and really hear our concerns and really try to understand them. And in the spaces where we can to elevate their voices, to Black and Brown voices, and in the spaces where they can't, to make sure that they're properly communicating what our interests are. But I want to end with the point, I think the most important thing is that even in those spaces where Black and Brown people are not represented, I think that should be our primary goal, is to make sure that across all those spaces that we're diversifying and bringing attention to all different voices and introducing all different types of people in different spaces, so that we can hear the voices straight from the horse's mouth. And I think ultimately that should be everyone's goal.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. Thank you so much. And I'd like to pass it on to the BIPOC Coalition for their question.
Hi, we're representatives from the UW-Madison BIPOC Coalition. My name is Lauren. And the first question that we had relates to the issue of court procedures, especially in relation to the executive branch. So considering the executive order hypothesis, which for reference for others is the idea that the president and the courts become more ideologically distant, the president issues more executive orders, and the increased reliance on executive orders during the last two presidencies, how do you think that packing the court would impact the future trends of executive order legislating?
Great question, and a question that's very very central and very important to the types of questions that I engage in my research. So I think when it comes to the judiciary plays a really important role in constraining the executive branch for both things like executive orders, but also the actions that agencies do. And so what their role is that if an executive branch actor, like an agency of the president, if they do something that exceeds their authority, the courts are kind of our last stop to making sure that that power is constrained within the boundaries of the law or within the boundaries of the Constitution. So ideally, we want our judges and justices to make cases, to decide cases based on what the law says and what the Constitution says. However, in reality, anyone that reads the news and that pays attention knows that it's much more complicated than that, and that, you know, judges and justices, they're human, and that they decide cases based on their own personal preferences, their own personal ideology. And so the danger in doing things like allowing a single president to be able to influence the judiciary so much with appointing people that think like him or that have the same ideology as him is that when you have a court case that challenges executive power, whether or not that executive is right or wrong, we have a court that's full of judges that might automatically side with the president because they share sort of ideology. And so the question is, how do you constrain a president? How does a court constrain a president if that court is made up of people that the president is friends with, that the president has similar ideology with? And so I think another difficult thing about the federal judiciary is that the appointments to the judiciary are lifetime, not only at the Supreme Court level, but also in our district courts and our Court of Appeals. And so the president can make these appointments, and these appointments stick for a very long time. And that can change the nature and the shape of the way that the courts make decisions. And so it can be very tough to try to change the direction of the court if the court is packed with people that share a similar like mind. So I think that really kind of brings attention to thinking about what reforms would be appropriate if you find that problematic, I don't want to influence your views too much, but if you find that problematic, what reforms would be appropriate to change the nature of the judiciary to make sure that we truly have a branch of government that's independent from the executive branch.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Our next question kind of goes back into political engagement, but in a different way, pertaining to the issue of campaign finance. So we wanted to know, as individual donors tend to be wealthy, white, and male, how, as students who are young, financially insecure, and more racially and ethnically diverse, command the attention of politicians to bring about more progressive change, especially with the importance of individual donors to campaign finance rising?
This is another great question. I think from what people see in the news, and then also from a lot of political science research, we've seen that politicians are very responsive to their donors. And I can understand, how people might be skeptical, or the regular voter might get disheartened by that if someone that has a big, can write a big check and sort of influence the decisions of their politicians. But one thing that I would try to encourage sort of the everyday folks is that your vote still matters. So one reason why donors are maybe as influential as they are is that they care about a lot of issues. And they care about a lot of issues that maybe regular people aren't educated about, or regular people don't care as much about. And so that gives them an opening to influence members of Congress, the president, on issues that voters just aren't paying attention to. And so I think the key here is for all of us to be educated on all of the important issues that are happening. And that leaves less room for outside influence. Because at the end of the day, these politicians are elected, they want to be reelected. And if they want to stay in office, they're going to have to be responsive to their constituents, or guess what? Or else they're out of office. And so just educate yourselves about what the issues are and make your voices heard. And that's going to be hard for politicians to ignore. And I think that's the key to kind of drown out some of these other outside influences. And of course, I'm going to preach all about reforms to different aspects of American democracy. And of course, this is another way that we can kind of think about reforms is reforming campaign finance, of course. But I think in the short term, the here and now, and when I say here and now, I mean like next week, just get out and vote.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for answering our questions. We're going to pass on to the Wisconsin Union Directorate.
Hello, Professor Thrower. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is David Lummis. I'm the director of the Society and Politics Committee here at the Union, and we're going to be asking some policy questions. This first question pertains to privacy concerns. So since the events of September 11th, the United States has really increased the scope and intensity of its surveillance programs, specifically here in the United States. And what role has the executive played in these programs? And is there really an avenue to hold them accountable?
So this is so important. So one of the reasons, so if you think about the way that executive power has grown over time, one of the reasons why it has grown over time is that there has been an increase in the responsibilities that the executive branch has. There's been an increase in people looking to the executive branch, and particularly the president, to take on sort of some of the growing challenges that the United States faces. And national security issues is one really primary sort of avenue by which executive actors have expanded their power. So for instance, in the wake of 9/11, we have this event where people are looking to the president for leadership. They're rallying around the president. And this has happened time and time again over time as different crises and things have happened. We look to the president to lead. And because of this leadership and this kind of growing responsibility, we have Congress giving the president more power. We have the courts deferring more to the president in these areas that they listen to the president for national leadership. And because of this, the president has been able to expand their powers. So in the case of national security, in the wake of 9/11, we hear about George W. Bush's, a lot of his controversial actions in the realm of national security. Well, one reason why he was able to do that was because, one, his popularity was so high after 9/11, people were rallying around him looking for leadership. And two, he had a Congress that backed him and his actions of what he was doing. So we have Congress kind of passing new legislation, giving the executive branch and the president more avenues to expand their powers. Now, I should say, as President Bush's term drew on and people kind of got weary of some of the conflicts that we were in, some of that authority was scaled back. So some of his authority was challenged in the courts and things like that. But still, 9/11 was very interesting because it created sort of this whole new realm of policymaking that gave the president opportunities to exercise even more authority.
Definitely. So this second question then is going to relate a little bit more towards like the broader powers of the president in foreign policy. So the president, through the ability to appoint ambassadors and being in charge of the different executive agencies, really seems to have a monopoly on foreign policy making. And considering the implications this is have for the average American, is this something that might be considered a legislative concern? Is this something we could consider delegating the authority to Congress? Or does this kind of have to remain in the president's ballpark?
So this is interesting. I don't know if I can give you a definitive answer to this, but I can tell you where some of these issues have come from and where they've evolved. So if we go back, we rewind all the way back to the founders and them writing the Constitution, this was one of their concerns when thinking about sort of how much foreign policy power to give the executive. Because on one hand, they didn't want a president that was so powerful that the president can kind of go around and do whatever he wants. They didn't want to repeat a situation where, they were under the tyrannical leadership of King George, from England. They didn't want to repeat that. But on the other hand, they knew that they were a very new country that was susceptible to foreign threats, that were vulnerable, and they needed to have a leader to have a strong response. So they're kind of balancing these two concerns. So what they did when they wrote the Constitution, they wanted to give the president some kind of expansive role in foreign policy, to give the president flexibility. So they wrote sort of vaguely that the president should be the commander-in-chief, but really didn't define that, just so that the president could sort of lead the military forces. But they also very intentionally gave the power to declare war to Congress. And so, readers of the Constitution think that, even though the president can command the military, sort of when we get into the situation should be determined by Congress. That's one interpretation of it. However, we know the United States hasn't declared war since World War II. So the nature of military conflicts has changed so much over time that we really don't have formal declarations of war, but we have these just different conflicts where the president's still able to send troops over to certain places to engage in sort of conflict without the approval of Congress. Now, Congress has tried to place limitations on the president's ability to do that through the War Powers Resolution. With that War Powers Resolution, under that, the president is supposed to inform and get Congress's approval if he's committed troops overseas, I think, for 60 days. Past that point, he's supposed to get congressional approval. But this is something that almost every president since it was passed has blatantly ignored, and it's just hard for Congress to enforce it. And again, just like national security, these foreign policy powers more generally, this has been an area where the public, Congress, the courts tend to defer to the president, because the president sort of has the advantage of being sort of one unifying leader, has the advantage of controlling the military and having different sorts of information that we don't have. But it is probably the area in which presidents have been able to expand their powers the most over time. So I think the short answer is this is one to really watch out for, and one to, if we want to think about how we can systematically limit presidential power. This is probably the primary vehicle by which we should be thinking about how to do that.
Well, fascinating. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Thrower, and I'm going to pass it to the ACLU.
Hello again. My name is Destiny. I'm the VP of the ACLU. And our next question is about voting and civil rights. So even though there exists a handful of legislation put in place to counteract 400 plus years of systemic racism, such as the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, there's still no effective law that successfully prevents racial bias and discrimination in all facets of life. But that being said, do you think such legislation can be made that is both effective and proactive enough to dismantle racial disparities, especially given that these laws will operate in a system that is inherently racist?
ACLU with the tough questions. I love this. So first, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, such huge pieces of legislation. I think just one place to start is just to make sure that those pieces of legislation are sustained and continually enforced. Like, I think that has to, and we know there's been all sorts of rollbacks to the Voting Rights Act. So that's first and foremost, just making sure that those pieces of legislation stay in place. I think in terms of passing other sort of huge systematic reforms, I guess one thing that I struggle with thinking about what that looks like and how to capture everything in one piece of legislation. I think what the answer should be is we know that there's so much systemic racism, and that if you give me any given issue area, I can point to like 10 things that it can cause sort of more systemic differences or perpetuate systemic racism. So I personally, I think the answer is that every piece of legislation, every law that is passed at all levels of government should have a section that deals with how to kind of prevent these biases and discriminations. Like, I think it needs to be in every law, because I think there could be something to be done in every area to kind of prevent more of this systemic racism. Yeah, I think that's, to me, I think that's the only solution, because I feel like big pieces of legislation, which I would still encourage and everything, but I still think that you can miss things. But anything that we deal with, any law that we passed, I think that we should be thinking about in every area, what can we do to prevent kind of the perpetuation of these systemic barriers? And that needs to be written in every single piece of legislation.
Thank you. I especially like the part where he talked about like sustainability in legislation. That was very interesting. But just for like sake of time, I'm gonna move on to the next question that we have, which is a state versus like executive powers in policing and military question. So considering the power of the state to mobilize the National Guard and the executive branch to mobilize the military, how do we see these powers competing in the policing of protests? And who, if anyone, should be policing these events?
Another difficult question. No, this is great. Like these are exactly the questions that we should be thinking about. I guess from the things that I've seen, I think it gets really tricky to think about who should be policing some of these protests, because the police involvement that I've seen has not been very positive. And so I guess I'm hesitant to carve out a role for either, the National Guard or the executive branch military. I mean, I guess I would advocate it staying local unless things get really out of hand. Otherwise, I see things escalating very quickly and escalating unnecessarily so, and also kind of unwarranted militarized responses that I don't think help. So I'd advocate just kind of keeping it local to local police handling it, not escalating. I mean, I think local police actually trying to engage with the issues as well, and knowing the community and knowing the actives and what's going on too, I think is going to help. So some of that community-based policing as well, besides just sort of militarized responses. But I'm hesitant to advocate for a national response to these protests because I don't think that they're helpful, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
Mhm.
I'm going to pass it on back to ASM.
Hi, Dr. Thrower. My name is Crystal. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Diverse Engagement Coordinator from ASM. So my first question is on presidential power and controversial issues. Controversial issues like gun control, environmental regulations, and prison industrial complex have been hot topics in the political debates for decades. Many presidents make promises for positive change during their campaigns, but changes are seldom made. How does the structure of our government support the executive branch or prevent them from making long-lasting changes on controversial issues?
Great question. I think, our founders set up the system of separation of powers and checks and balances to sort of prevent one branch of government from expanding their powers too much. So, for instance, if the presidents, even in the realm of the executive branch, where we think the president might have sort of unilateral powers to institute changes, as I mentioned before, they're still checked by the courts. They're still checked by Congress. When we think about federal regulations can also sort of be overturned by Congress, can be overturned by the courts. And so I think when we have this system, it can be hard to institute change, particularly when we have three branches of government that are controlled by different political parties that are having a hard time working together. And as all of you know, over time, polarization between the parties has gotten so much worse that it's so hard to get anything done. These last few Congresses, they've been the least productive Congresses in history because the parties aren't working together. Even within the executive branch that are not being sort of supported, or actions are being stalled by the other branches of government. In some cases, that can be good. It can be good for maybe the president's not to exert too much power, or it can be good for checking undesirable policies, but it can also be sort of negative in that it's just really hard to get anything done. So I think, just kind of shortly answer your question, I think just the way of our separation of powers system and the degree of polarization, I think it's hard for any branch of government to really get anything done effectively and quickly, compared to earlier time periods when bipartisan cooperation was so much easier and so much more common than it is today.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful information. I guess going off that question, I want to know about a specific issue, which is housing discrimination. From lack of access to loans to unfair housing prices to redlining. Housing discrimination affects many marginalized people in this country. Specifically, Madison, we do have a large homeless population. So how can housing discrimination be addressed by the executive branch instead of the current structure where the state and local government propose various policies and housing programs? And I guess also going off your answer earlier, do you think it is more helpful for them to be addressed at a local level or at the national level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would advocate for both. I guess one problem with the state and local level, not all state governments are going to agree that, housing discrimination and other sorts of issues of housing are an actual issue. They may not necessarily prescribe to that, depending on sort of their political affiliations, their political beliefs. And so it's helpful to have sort of a federal government that can step in and fill in those gaps. And particularly what is needed most is for Congress to pass legislation. Because that legislation is going to give presidents the authority to kind of direct their agencies to make regulations, and then also to issue unilateral powers. And again, kind of similar to my answer on education policy too, I think it's going to be the federal government's role also to fund some of these programs, even some of the programs that are initiated at the state and local level. It's going to be critical for the federal government to fund some of these programs, particularly in a time now during this global pandemic that we're in, where state and local governments are becoming even more financially strapped. And the way that they, almost all state constitutions, state governments are required to balance their budget, so they can't have deficit spending where the federal government can. And so that might limit state governments and really kind of advocating or advancing a lot of different programs in different areas because they're just so financially strapped. And so that is a way that the federal government can kind of step in and fund some of these things. And so whether or not that takes, the form of strong federal mandates versus a more decentralized structure that's going to have to be kind of left to our federal decision makers. However, I will say, kind of back to my point, is this is probably an area, I think, in general, areas of kind of discrimination and things like that are probably the areas where we need a strong federal response if state governments are just not doing anything and they're not prescribing to it, because it's sort of unfair for citizens of the United States to get different treatment based on the state that they live in. And so I think this is where the federal government can step in and help to equalize some of these policies.
Thank you so much. And I'll pass it along to BIPOC Coalition.
So hey, Sharece Thrower, just want to thank you so much for coming again. I am Joshua. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a representative part of the UW Madison BIPOC Coalition. So our next question pertains to the past and present mishandling of health crises in the United States. In the 80s, Reagan and his administration did not want to acknowledge the AIDS epidemic in America. Can you or would you say there could be a comparison made between the actions of the Reagan administration and what could be seen as a demonstration of unitary executive theory in the current administration's refusal to address the current pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. I think making comparisons to the AIDS epidemic is really interesting. It got me thinking about kind of what the commonalities are between these cases. I would say for certain administrations and people that prescribe to certain political ideologies, and I'll try myself not to get too political myself. I try to stay as unbiased as I can. But I think that sort of one of the issues, particularly with the current administration, is denying the science behind things, denying the science behind sort of what the health experts have been saying about the pandemic, and I think we can draw parallels to other different administrations. I think one thing that's really interesting to me about the lack of federal response from the pandemic is, as I mentioned before, in times of crisis, these are the moments where we look to the federal government for leadership, and we particularly look to the president to sort of exert strong authority. Interestingly enough, these are the times that we give presidents even more leeway. So the public does, the courts, Congress. There's so much authority that we can give to the president, and usually every president would jump at the chance to be able to exercise authority, because that also has long-term implications for just expanding the scope of presidential power over time and what they can do in other areas. So it's interesting to me that the president under this administration, and also kind of drawing comparisons to Reagan, would not jump at the chance to kind of expand their authority in that sort of way. And I think it's kind of atypical about what we think presidents kind of have incentives to do. And again, a reason that could be is sort of some of their other conflicting beliefs about medicine, about science, and quite honestly, about their compassion towards certain communities.
Thank you. Our next question is related to power structures. So how does the way that we misunderstand the power structures within the university administration parallel the way that we misunderstand the power structures within the government, specifically relating to how people and students have considerably less power than led to believe?
Really good question, really heavy question too. So I'm glad we're talking about power, because the interesting thing about power is I feel like we can see similar sorts of power dynamics in various sorts of situations, and like you said, university administration and government and things like that. So I'm glad that you're asking this question. So there's this book by John Gaventa called Power and Powerlessness. And he wrote about different power dynamics. And maybe many of you read it for some of your core classes. But I like the way that he talks about power. He talks about basically there are these three faces of power. And so basically there's kind of these three ways that power can manifest. And so the first face of power is it's basically about direct conflicts. So in government, Congress passes a piece of legislation, the president vetoes it. That's a direct conflict. In university administration, maybe a student group asks the administration for something, they say no, they reject it. That's a first phase of conflict. Those are direct, those are easy to kind of observe. But it's kind of the second and third phases of power that I think people should be aware of and really think through, and the way to get past those. So the second phase of power entails basically sort of, it has to do with structural barriers to actually advocating for your own interests. So maybe there are things in the way that are going to stop groups from advocating for their power. So in the case of government, it could be that maybe Congress decides not to propose a piece of legislation because they know that Congress is going to shut them down. Or maybe some groups decide not to ask for something because they're going to be shut down, or because it's just difficult for them to ask for stuff. There might be some systematic barriers to actually advocating for your interests that stop you from advocating for that. And so I think that's something that if you're a group that's in less power, to think about ways that you can overcome that. And then the third phase of power, I think it's very kind of can be depressing to think about. The third phase of power is that you're a group and you don't have power, but you don't even realize that you lack power because you've been worn down for so long from these systemic barriers that you lack a group consciousness to actually advocate for your interests, that you don't even know what your interests are. And I think that can be the most devastating part, is that you don't even know what kind of disadvantages that you face. And so I would say for, student organizations, or if you're facing sort of other power dynamics within university administration, I think a good first step is to really coalesce on identifying sort of what your group consciousness is, what your interests are, what you're fighting for, and to really rally behind that and know what it is that you're fighting for. And then the second thing is to think about ways, so that was like the third phase of power. And then the second thing is to think about ways that you can get around some of these barriers that you might be facing to even ask for anything. That's easier said than done, because a lot of these barriers have been constructed over many years. But I think one way to do that is to find advocates for people that are in power. So maybe professors that you know that can advocate your interests, who are in a little bit better position than you are, kind of using that. or organizing together. If you get enough people on the same page, it's hard to ignore. So organizing in that sort of way. So I think, kind of long story short, I think really to understand and get past some of these power dynamics is just to sort of really understand your position, to get a group consciousness, to find ways to overcome some of these systemic barriers that you might be facing.
Thank you so much. We'll definitely use some of this advice. Next, I'm going to throw it over to Carrie.
Great. Well, first off, thank you so much, Dr. Thrower, tonight for all of your amazing answers about these executive orders and executive issues for us to know about and take forward in our everyday lives. And also, we have had one more question develop out of breaking news. So as Amy Coney Barrett was just confirmed to the Supreme Court, how likely do you see the idea of Courtpacking playing out if a Democratic candidate is elected? And how would you envision the Democratic and Republican parties moving forward on the issue? And thirdly, how might these discussions affect the judiciary moving forward?
Oh, I love breaking news. This is great. Talking about it here. Let's go. So I think one thing with this with the nomination and now the confirmation, I think one thing that is really interesting that I've seen is how big of an issue this has been in this election. Whereas before, usually in matters of the Supreme Court appointments, this is not really sort of the hot button issues that kind of are pervasive in elections. So I think one direct effect, at least in the immediate term, is one thing I think would be interesting to see is how this mobilizes Democratic voters. A lot of Democrats are upset about sort of everything that has transpired, the timing of everything, some of the hypocrisy, of accused hypocrisy of the Republican Party. So even though Republicans might have a short-term victory in getting this nomination confirmed, maybe it's a long-term loss if it mobilizes Democrats to the polls and eventually votes the Republican president out of office and Republican senators and members of the House, if this is a mobilizing issue. I think it also has put the issue of judicial reform on the agenda in such a much more meaningful way than it's been in the past. Now, as long as I've sort of been alive, I think people have sort of floated the idea of reforming the appointment system to the judiciary, maybe not having lifetime appointments, making it sort of more equitable. But I think that the way that things have transpired with this nomination and the number of appointments that this president has gotten and the nature of these appointments and the timing and all everything surrounding it, I think this is putting this issue of reform on near the top of Democratic party leaders' agendas. And I think this is something that we're going to see sort of come up in the Democratic Congress. And, we've already heard, Joe Biden talk about, I think initially tried to avoid the topic, but now sort of more embracing that this is definitely an issue that needs to be dealt with. Democrats advocating for expanding the number of the judiciary, number of people sitting on the Supreme Court. Also, maybe getting rid of lifetime appointments, having sort of more cyclical appointments. Anyway, all of this is to say is that I think that this has become a salient issue in a way that we haven't seen before. I think we'll definitely see more concrete proposals for reform. And I think that this can be a tool that Democrats can use to mobilize voters for the election next week.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that last minute addition to our discussion today. And once again, thank you so much for all the enlightening discussion that we've had tonight. Any last pieces of advice or thoughts as students prepare to go out to the polls next week and vote? Any last pieces of advice or thoughts?
Yes. Vote. Please vote. This is like your opportunity to make your voice heard. And this is a more critical election than ever, particularly since, there's been all sorts of efforts to delegitimize our vote, especially for young people. So make your voice count and go out and vote and tell a friend and bring a chair because it might be a long line, but come prepared.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And if our followers are looking to find you, where would the best place to reach you at be? A Twitter, a Facebook, a online website? Where's the best place that we could find you and your information, your research?
That's right. So you can go to my website, ShareceThrower.com. Very easy to remember. I also have the same Twitter handle at Sharece Thrower. And also send me an email at sharece.d.thrower@vanderbilt.edu. I'd love to hear from all of you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight for this conversation. And this is only one of the first of many Rise Up Week events that we'll be having this week. Specifically coming up, we'll be having Wood Cuisine. We'll be doing the history of election cakes around the Civil War and how to make an election cake, as well as Wood Film is showing 2 or 3 documentaries. And Wood Art will be doing therapeutic collaging for all the stress that comes during midterms, voting season, all of that. So make sure to go to union.wisc.edu to check out all of those events. And as you are going to those events, you can enter in to win a terrace chair. We're not giving away just mini terrace chairs this year, but also a full actual size terrace chair. So thank you all so much for joining this evening, and we hope you all have a good rest of the night.